Let me start by saying thanks. First of all, you, the audience, thank you for joining us today. I would also like to thank our hosts, the Sakib Sabanci Museum. I couldn't think of a more fitting and enjoyable venue. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Sakib Sabanci University for supporting this event generously. And I would like to thank the University of Reading and the European Commission for enabling the research project Typo Arabic that stood behind the book that I'm going to talk about a little bit today. And I would like to extend a special thank you to Onur Yazıcıgil, who conceived of this event, organized it, and we wouldn't be here without him, and thank you very much. As you see, the title of my talk is Building Bridges. I'm trying to make a case for a book that straddles two worlds. So I'll be talking about books and one book in particular. That is because books are a central point of reference in the education and professional life of designers of texts. They serve as a reference in two ways. First, as implicit or silent models for configurations of texts, and second, as explicit conduits for the articulated knowledge of the trade itself. Against apparent technological odds and self-serving predictions of the death of the book, it has retained this position to this day. Books remain a central model for typography for reading, irrespective of the medium. That Richard Rutter's Web Typography was published as a printed book in 2017 is a point in case. And for better or worse, text configurations that originated in the codex still influence how typography is practiced on screens. Books also continue to play an important role in the training of designers. There are numerous publications that offer guidance for typographic practice, providing the discursive backdrop for design courses. Some books have become standard works that are regularly consulted in training, as well as in design practice. It is easy to imagine a conversation in class or amongst colleagues where someone asks, "What does Bringhurst say?" How do Mitchell and Whiteman think about it? Or indeed, was schreiben Wilberg und Forssmann? For despite the current predominance of English language publications, there are local traditions of typographic design, and some also have discursive components. In the German language tradition, which I'm most familiar with, central works have not been translated. They have been highly influential for at least two generations of designers, but their ideas and approaches to the design of texts have remained exclusive to readers of German. By contrast, some books have become hugely influential beyond their origins. Joost Hochhuli's Das Detail in der Typografie has been translated into 6 languages, and Robert Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style in even more, including Greek and Russian, which employ different scripts altogether. This body of literature, in conjunction with graduates of European and American design universities, who are now teaching around the world, the mushrooming of branch campuses of Western universities that Jerry mentioned, and the dominance of visual languages of multinational brands, Latin script typography has largely become synonymous with typography as such. But despite the wide use of the Latin script, the admitted importance of English as the current lingua franca, and the significance of Western visual language also as a carrier of desirable values and ideas. There's a whole world out there that does not use the Latin script. And the consideration of its needs, the discussion of its various characteristics, and the exchange about its qualities all too often remain a footnote at best. Take Wikipedia as an example. Whereas the entry for typography is phrased in general terms and it includes some nods to its East Asian history, images and references are overwhelmingly to Western typography. A section that suggests treatment by writing systems only features 3 entries: Arabic, East Asian, and again, the history of Western typography. And as the Arabic entry demonstrates, its scope is not extensive. Have you tried looking for publications on Indic typography on Amazon? It yields an HBO production called Indictment, but nothing usable for the global typographer. If you try Indian, you get an inspirational poem by Chief Tecumseh. And if you like, you can try world typography instead. But the outcome remains sobering. Yet the users are there. So what do they consult to inform their work? Which resources can the design professional, whether based in LA or in Milan, draw on when he works on a project involving Arabic? What are the publications educators put on their reading lists? More than once I was asked by students for literature suggestions that would help them deepen their understanding of Arabic typography, and I was at pains explaining the lack of sources and the characteristics of the few available choices. But if this is the situation in design literature, how does the scholarly discourse compare to it? Research and writing are, after all, rarely second nature to designers, but they are central in the humanities. And indeed, over the last quarter of a century, the contours of the academic field of Middle Eastern book history have sharpened. Numerous contributions have carved out a subfield of book history with substantial research and lively discussions. Yet, and with a few exceptions, its engagement with typography, its visual qualities and its material properties has been minimal. Most historiography of the Middle Eastern book falls into the genre of cultural history, pursued with a strong textual and sociocultural approach. Looking at stuff, as Jerry likes to put it, is not a strength of this branch of inquiry, as can be demonstrated with numerous examples. In reference to the famous historical account of Antoine Galland, that Arabic volumes of the Typographia Medicea were not sold because of their ugliness, one author reframes it as an objection against ugly grammatical errors. Another voice considers the dislike of printing on aesthetic grounds that is found in multiple historical sources as rather nebulous. And yet, another author qualifies Richard Watts' Arabic type that was already deemed unacceptable by missionary printers in the 1830s as quite elegant in appearance. As the art historian Dagmar Riedel noted in her research blog in 2012, I suspect that the use of undocumented images as illustrations most likely reflects a learned lack of interest for the materiality of written texts. As long as graduate education in Middle Eastern and Islamic studies is centered on teaching scholars how to base their arguments on the meaning of words only, the text's embodiment in any particular medium is perceived as secondary, and illustrations, as nice as they may be, are accidental. Yet, whilst it is easy to point out the omission of visual aspects in much of Middle Eastern book history, Robin Kinross already reminded us in 1992 that typographic history has its own shortcomings. As he noted, this kind of history is the only one to recognize the aesthetic factors in printing, but it has had the tendency to do little else but view. A lot has happened in the last 30 years, though, and typographic history has come a long way. To paraphrase Kinross, it has begun to do its time in the archives, and the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication in Reading has been instrumental in this process. Its approach to integrate theory and practice has not only produced substantial original research, but has become a recognized model. So, when I was given the opportunity to design a research project at the department in 2018, these observations and experiences informed my thinking. There was an identified need for sound discussions of Arabic typographic design. There was a growing body of scholarly literature that was not well equipped to engage questions of visual qualities and material properties. The two worlds of Middle Eastern book history and typographic design barely talk to each other. And my ideas and previous work aligned with the department's record of cross-fertilizing research and practice. Specifically, I wanted to look at the second half of the 19th century, which I had identified as a key moment for Arabic typography. At this point, after 400 years of disinterest, really, in movable type, the Muslim Middle East adopted Arabic typography and turned it into a resounding success. And local craftspeople did that, using their own type and devising their own configurations that were rooted in local reading conventions. Arguably, they set the foundations for Arabic design for reading, producing exemplary models of practice that stand out to this day. If I wanted to do research to inform contemporary design, this seemed like a moment in history worth studying. So in mid-2019, I set about roaming the collections of key research libraries, scouring them for books printed between the 1850s and the 1910s in three centers of the Middle Eastern publishing revolution: Beirut, Cairo, and Istanbul. And whilst looking at things, often in great detail, was central to this work, I also took measurements of typographic parameters and recorded them in a spreadsheet quantifying this data. I was hoping to do a little more than view. Half a year into the project, I attended one of the last in-person conferences before COVID hit Europe, the A-Type Working Seminar in Amiens in France. Fittingly, it was dedicated to PhD research in typography. But beyond the official program, it provided an opportunity to discuss an idea that had been growing in the back of my head. I wanted to include more voices and perspectives to broaden and amplify the scope and relevance of the project. And so the idea of an edited volume with multiple contributions that combined, on one hand, historical research, on the other hand, with applied design emerged, setting in motion this project. Now, identifying other contributors whose work would complement the essays that I had planned, followed a few fairly simple criteria. First of all, their research interest had to match the book's concept. Second, they should have recently concluded substantial original research on the subject. And third, they should have a record of writing or publishing that showed rigor and depth. And luckily, I had a short list of people whose accomplishment matched these criteria. Emanuela Conidi had finished her PhD investigating the adaptation of Arabic script forms to typography in 2018, and I knew that her study was very substantial and had yet to be published anywhere. Onur Yazıcıgil completed his PhD on Ottoman Arabic foundry type just as we started to talk about this book in 2020. And the presentations of his preliminary findings had already been excellent. Borna Izzatbana was also in the final month of his PhD research on Persian foundry type and had already produced standout publications, curated exhibitions, and demonstrated that his research findings were going to be serious. And to my great delight, all of them came on board, and Jerry Leonidas agreed to write an introduction. In my view, this made for quite a presentable lineup. Not only had all contributors just recently completed substantial historical research projects, but they are all practitioners. For it was this unique perspective of typographic designers, trained and experienced as scholars of history, that I hope to assemble in this volume. The idea was to speak to two worlds, design and academia, and bridge the divide between scholarly publishing and more mainstream publishing, a divide that seems wholly inadequate in our field. For not only can historians trained in textual analysis benefit from taking into account aspects of material culture and the perspectives of visually trained people, but also practitioners have a whole lot to gain from historical knowledge. There can be no doubt that practice that is severed from historical precedent risks hapless repetition, uncritical imitation, and the unwitting reinvention of the wheel. My first book was published with a scholarly publisher, with all the corresponding benefits and drawbacks. Whilst the book is currently available in more than 1,000 libraries across the world, which is a considerable reach for such a specialized topic, its price has made it less accessible for individuals. Moreover, it does not show up in bookshops that cater to designers, making it more difficult to find for practitioners. So for this project, I wanted the book to be more affordable for individuals and to be more visible in the design world. But it should be available around the world too, and I did not want to compromise on its production quality either. So I developed a book proposal and pitched it to a small selection of publishers who fitted the bill. And the Swiss imprint Nigli was quick to show an interest in the book. Yet they also pointed out that, although certainly interesting, the book that I was proposing fell into a small niche. It was not going to be a global bestseller, and on its own merits alone, it was too risky economically. Thankfully, however, the research project was endowed with a budget that we could use to subsidize the print production, and thus Nigli and I signed a publishing contract for a book with the title Arabic Typography, History and Practice. And at this point, I would like to thank again the European Commission's Horizon 2020 research program, without whose funding this book could not have been made. I would also like to thank our publisher, Markus Braun, for his support of the project and his trust in our ability to deliver despite delays and the puzzlement of dealing with university bureaucracy. In many ways, Niggli is an ideal partner for us. Founded in 1950, it has an incredible legacy of typographic titles. From Ruders typography to Hochli's detail in typography, there is plenty of good company. The house cares about how its books are made, and I'm pleased to say that our books comes in full color and saddle stitch bound. Finally, global distribution through Thames and Hudson does make sure that this volume will be available wherever someone on this planet cares about Arabic typography. In terms of the volume's contents, I don't want to take too much away, especially in view of the following talks. Suffice it to say that Emanuela, Borna, and Onur have chosen a specific aspect of their respective research subjects and synthesized them into essays that at once treat their subjects in depth and at the same time branch out to connect to contemporary research-driven practice. In my own historical essay, I investigate questions surrounding the contribution of typography to the emergence of the modern Middle East. Taking the Nahda, the movement of Arabic literary renewal, as its point of reference, the essay develops a typographic perspective of this central cultural phenomenon, investigating its material form. It looks at books in the first sense that I evoked at the beginning of this talk, as models for configurations of texts. But whilst focusing on the physical and visual characteristics of select volumes, the essay also considers the context in which they emerged. It touches on the technical, political, and economical influences that shaped books of this era, and explores the trade as an interregional network, tracing the fluid and often reciprocal influences of the publishing centers in Cairo, Beirut, and Istanbul. From the Mehahimiyah, the Treatise of Water, published in the 1790s, to a 1911 edition of Qasim Amin's Al-Mara al-Jadida, the essay charts the evolution of Arabic typography in the long 19th century. Through the examination of about a dozen publications, it sheds light on various aspects of the history of Arabic typography during this important foundational phase. Its central argument that the typographic craft supplied the material fabric of the Nahda is reiterated in the conclusion of the piece, arguing for a new appreciation of the role that the form of print played in the emergence of a modern Middle East. The second part of the book, Foundations of Arabic Typography, focuses on the practice of Arabic typography. Inspired by Hochli's detail in typography, it concisely discusses applied aspects of Arabic design for reading, principally conceived for students and designers who are not fully familiar with the Arabic script. It hopes to contribute to addressing a glaring gap in current literature. Foundations of Arabic Typography introduces the reader to central characteristics of the Arabic script, discusses some elements of its manuscript tradition, and considers key questions of microtypography. It explores some of the nuts and bolts of text composition, like measure, interlinear space, justification. And it discusses the particularities of poetry and multilingual settings. It also features an overview of the main writing styles of the Islamic calligraphic tradition, with samples by none other than the master calligrapher Muhammad Zakaria, and casts a critical view on some typographic terminology and the suitability of these existing design approaches. this section offers some hands-on advice for a selection of use cases, and with cross-references from and to the historical studies in the first part of the book, Foundations of Arabic Typography seeks to live the concept of research-informed design. Finally, it is a particular pleasure that Robert Bringhurst agreed to write a preface to this volume. In his short text, he reflects on the importance of looking beyond your immediate typographic surroundings in a manner that he demands to be more engaged than a mere tourist jaunt. He frames the book as a gateway to one of the world's great scriptorial traditions, which, I hope you will agree, provides an ideal entry point to the following discussion of Arabic typography and type making. And I would like to end as I started, and I'd like to conclude with saying thanks. And I would like to thank my fellow authors, whose dedication to this project was second to none. Despite serious other commitments, like finishing PhD theses, juggling design day jobs and roles in universities, and against the backdrop of the minor distraction that the global health crisis provided, they stayed the course and completed their respective pieces. The discussions that arose in the process were enriching, the questions not always easily resolved, the delays nerve-rattling, and the final outcome is, I believe, testament to the intensity of the engagement. I'm grateful that we could pull this off together. Thank you very much.